Did you know that Boeing didn't make a profit for the first 20 years they were around? Yeah, the more I've been digging into it lately, the history of Boeing and the founder is named after William E. Boeing, who seems to go back to like German aristocracy, but there's this other guy who's the co-founder. He was total military. It's basically been a military, part of the military-industrial complex since the very beginning. And I kind of expected to have this video done weeks ago, but the story just kind of keeps progressing. And I started getting curious about, all the stuff coming out in the news about all the issues with Boeing. Basically, when the time that, the door plugs popped out on that one flight, and they had to make an emergency landing, and the kid's shirt supposedly got sucked. It was a weird story, but basically from that point on, it kind of became mainstream news, and then there was all these different emergency landings, and all that just quickly started happening all over the world. And then with the whistleblowers, the fact that the guy it's not just that he died mysteriously, but that it was done in such a way that to me, it seems hard not to conclude that it was being done in such an obvious way that they wanted people to know. And it's basically become a meme at this point, all the safety issues with Boeing and don't fly on a Boeing. And, once it kind of hit that meme level, that's when it was like, okay, this is a narrative that is being intentionally crafted and intentionally put to the public. I mean, just because a whistleblower got knocked off, there's the two now with the guy who, he had a rapid infection and died. It's real suspicious. That one's a little less obvious, but if that one just by itself had happened, then maybe it wouldn't be super obvious. But the guy getting shot in his car at lunch, that's like, you're not being discreet. So, and then of course they had the hearing in Congress where they do the whole showboating kind of spectacle. So, but I mean, this has been something that's been going on for years with the whole decline of Boeing. So I'm not saying it's not like a real issue. And, I grew up in Seattle, so the whole saga of Boeing and the unions is something it was always in the news, and I knew tons of people whose dad worked at Boeing and stuff like that. So it's been a long decline, and I'm not saying it's all just, a psyop or whatever, but at the same time, so I've been kind of fascinating with how that's all hitting the news. Because, I mean, whistleblowers, they never talk about Kary Mullis dying suspiciously right before COVID, so the fact that they're even reporting on it says something in and of itself. They've put out all kinds of specials on this, and they're not running cover for Boeing the way they run cover for all kinds of corporate malfeasance and mismanagement, and hopefully that doesn't need a lot of explanation at this point. But the fact that it's kind of coinciding with the Boeing Starliner launch that keeps getting delayed and delayed and delayed, and it was originally going to be like over a month ago when they were going to launch their first crewed mission to the ISS on this capsule they've been working on for 7 years or whatever, and keeps getting delayed. So I kept waiting to see if it was going to launch, and then maybe there would be something, are they going to have a big dramatic equipment failure kind of thing happen, and then that'll somehow tie into this Boeing's fall from grace. Boeing, it's basically already kind of lost the race, so to speak, with SpaceX and Crew Dragon and all that, but they're still pushing forward, and they got, Sonny Williams and this, what's his name? Greg or Barry or some, they're both like 60 years old. The whole thing is such a farce, right? But this is why it's fascinating that this is all going on at the same time. And so now I think they've pushed it forward to June 1st. And I listened to a handful of press conferences and NASA. The weird thing is that they've been putting out very little. It's been even really hard to even follow when the next launch is supposed to be. It's just been kind of a big convoluted thing. But the latest is that it's been rescheduled for June 1st. And they found the reason they delayed it before was, first it had to do with the Atlas rocket supposedly, and then this last one was because there was a leak, a helium leak. I mean, it's pretty crazy when you're listening to a bunch of NASA and Boeing reps talking about helium for like an hour and a half. The helium, they say it's to push the rocket fuel through the motor or whatever, but I think it's, obviously I think it's because that's what powers the rocket. It's just a big pointy helium balloon, and then they have a little fire at the bottom, to sell the effect, but there's nobody riding in these things. So there is a certain amount of technical they do want it to go right in terms of like stuff can break and blow up, and maybe they even have a self-destruct kind of button just to blow it up. Because I've seen videos from the early V2 days where it literally just like hovers sideways, like across a meadow, barely off the platform, and just like float. They're balloons. That's basically what I think all these rockets are, is big pointy zeppelins with some fire at the bottom, but that's not what's providing most of the lift. But so yeah, it's all marketing. It's all part of this Launch America, this private, where they contracted out with SpaceX and Boeing and Blue Origin to, compete to who could take Americans back into space again. And so SpaceX has already been supposedly delivering people to the ISS, and they've got their CGI booster rockets that land on the stupid raft. All this nonsense, and Boeing's still trying to get basically the exact same thing that they say they flew to the moon in the 60s with. It's just the same. It's the same little capsule design with touchscreen computers and their dorky blue astronaut outfits. So yeah, it's interesting because however much of the mismanagement and the greed that is played into the deterioration of Boeing, I'm not saying that that's not like a real effect of changing their production line to all these little outsourced companies and production facilities, and they're just trying to make more money and pay the workers less, and it's the same story that has played out in so many other industries. But that's, I think, also why this is so interesting to kind of be following along with the narratives that they're creating here, and how it is kind of like a microcosm. It's an example of the trend, because this legacy, quote unquote legacy company that so many people devoted their whole lives to being engineers and assembly line workers, and it used to be something that people were really proud to work at a company like Boeing, when I was a kid, because they're building these amazing machines that are getting used all over the world. And it was this huge, source of pride and accomplishment. And it's just so interesting to think about how that whole kind of like legacy narrative, that American mythos of a company that broke all this new ground and ties into all the World War II mythology. I don't know what else to call it. To me, it is really like a mythology of Memphis Belle and all that stuff. It's been so romanticized, along with all the American perception of World War II, saving the world from Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany and everything. So, but then just like going back through and realizing how, once you come to that conclusion that there's no outer space, we're not spinning through a giant vacuum, and nobody's going 17,000 miles an hour. I think that's the part that I just keep coming back to again and again. Like the absurdity that human beings jumped from going 3,000 or 4,000 miles supposedly an hour in like the X-15. I don't even know if we could definitively say that was ever accomplished. It's just basically you have to take their word for it. But even if you do, say like, okay, the exponential jump from the fastest any human ever flew, in any of these rocket planes or supersonic jets or any other form of human flight, just doesn't even come close to the absurd claim beginning with Yuri Gagarin, and then the Americans supposedly having a suborbital flight of their, strapping yourself to the nose of a rocket. And the G-force, there's just no way a human body would. It's so laughable to me at this point. But then, okay, so Boeing was involved in building part of the Saturn rocket for the Apollo missions. It was involved in the space shuttle. It was involved in, I think, the X-15. And they've absorbed so many of these other companies too that, it's all just basically one big complex. Like looking at the way that even just passenger airlines are built, it's like what a perfect example of the compartmentalization of these incredibly complex projects. But then Boeing, so here's the thing. Here's the thing that is kind of hilarious to me, is that, supposedly they're suddenly having all this trouble launching a capsule, the same little cone-shaped basic design that they were able to do in the 1960s without anybody dying while airborne, no failures. And yet suddenly they're having all this problem with like this helium seal, which they did not fix. They're going to go ahead and launch with this leak This is what's weird, because it seems like they're setting up for, I don't know, some kind of failure, and then they could just blame their incompetence.
I think if I was a young astronaut and I was thinking about going to the moon, I think I'd put my hand up and say, I want to fly Starliner. Yeah.
But Boeing built the Unity module for the International Space Station, which has been supposedly flying around the globe for over 25 years. And when you think about the seals and the pressures being put on those components, going back and forth between 250 degrees heat and then minus 250 in the shade, like 20 times a day, back and forth, just in the vacuum of space, and the wear and it's amazing when you really stop and think about, how real it becomes when you think about being on like if you're on a little Boeing 787 or 737 or whatever jetliner, and a door flies off or part of the window pops out or something, and you realize like how terrifying that would be. And yet, like, being on the space station would be just 1,000 times more trepidatious and more like that's nothing compared to flying at 17,000 miles an hour in a vacuum with extreme heat and cold and micrometeorites. But you're just playing with your food and making bubbles, and the whole thing is such a joke. But yet, the psychology of how space flight and the whole space age, when it came about in the 50s and 60s, and everyone experienced the reality of like, okay, now we can get on a jumbo jet on a 747, and the whole world is now shrunk because we live in this age of affordable jet travel. And that was the part of the quote unquote space age that was real and we all experienced, and we've all just, it's been normalized. And this whole idea of like, you get on this plane and it's like a big, now, the deterioration in just the experience of flying versus several decades ago is pretty amazing. Now it feels more like a Greyhound in the sky, and it's really not fun. But it really sold the world on this idea of just being able to go anywhere you want, and essentially turning all the cities in the world into one big city. And that's kind of where I think a lot of these discussions about space fakery and the narratives, the transhumanist narratives, where it factors into the massive shift that has gone on in the 20th century and now into the 21st, but like the massive migration to the cities. And just the ability to move people around in a way that, before you'd have to take a ship or a train to travel that far. And that became normalized for a couple generations, where we just assumed that you could travel anywhere in the world in a day or two. And then, of course, in 2020, that whole normalized expectation being weaponized. And I suppose that began right after 9/11 with the Patriot Act and the security measures and being groped at the airport and normalizing all the stuff that for the longest time you could just go get on your plane, or you could wait at the terminal for somebody arriving. And 9/11 changed air travel around the world, even though there were airports operating in all these different governments and countries. But with COVID, in 2020, that ability to travel was then weaponized in a new way, on a new level. And how many people just went out and joined the experiment just to be able to get on a plane. And it's wild to just think about legacy and the way we kind of get sold on an idea of the future, or it's so hard to imagine that like the majority of humans who ever lived, that was just this dream that one day mankind would fly like the birds. And when that was finally achieved, it was this like massive point in human history. Even though when you look into the history of flight and the development, all going from propellers to the jet engine, there's a lot of really peculiar episodes. Supposedly this British guy who flew these little biplanes and model airplanes, like just thought it up in his head, like how to build a jet engine, and then they developed it for the British Air Force without even having a way to like know if it would work. It's so weird to me. And then supposedly it got leaked to the Germans, and so they were developing the jet engine at the same time. But then, so the Americans and the British developed jet engines, but then eventually had to like bring this guy after World War II as part of Operation Paperclip. And it was a big mucky muck at Boeing who was involved in Operation Paperclip to bring this German engineer who had developed the idea of the swept wing. Because when you had the straight wings, it was, they would wobble. So they had an engine without a plane. You know, there's just so many examples like this where it's all this back and forth. Like you'd think that the guy who invented the jet engine would be like one of the most famous people, but he got knighted, and I'm just saying, I feel like all the more you look into all the history of this, it really does kind of take you back to this idea of Francis Bacon and the New Atlantis, and there's like some basically secret society. I mean, when you think about like, okay, whoever owns the patent office is really the one who's going to have control over the releasing and the development and the profiting off of whatever technologies. Like, so, and then you use war and conflict and all this stuff to then get the public to kind of buy into narratives and to allocate spending. And so that's just what's been going on in increasing measures over the past several centuries. But it's weird to see people who are still so like, oh, we're just a few years away from going back to the moon and Mars, and yeah, and there's so much anticipation and just obsession with this dream. You hear this word, like even in that Boeing video I played at the beginning. If you watch enough NASA in space propaganda, it's like the buzzword of all time, achieving this dream. And what is this dream? And what is the reality? Has it really liberated us and created this? I mean, it's not that it's a sin to fly in an airplane, obviously, but when you look at it on the macro scale in all the obvious ways that, yeah, you can wage war and drop bombs and overthrow countries who don't want your banking system and everything like that. But then creating a network of cities that are all controlled and... But yeah, I'm kind of more fascinated with air travel. It's weird how, growing up I was not interested in aeronautics or the history of aviation and, all these companies. And I think now I'm almost on a mission to watch every piece of NASA propaganda that came out in the 20th century. I mean, after that, it kind of just gets really lame, but it's like the most fascinating TV show ever, or movie production legacy. Because it ties into so many other propaganda narratives, from nuclear war and the Cold War and computing and, what will we dream of next? I mean, isn't it amazing that, like, okay, on a launch, the seal, they said it's like the size of a button on a shirt. Like, we're talking a tiny, but they're going to go ahead and launch anyways, so it's not a big deal, but except when it's... The point being, like, so many things can go wrong in the launch, and it's this big deal, and all these safety checks, but then the O-rings on the cupola, right? Like, all the seals and the vacuums, like you're recycling your own urine and waste and air, and any leak anywhere in that entire complex is bad news. Way worse news than anything that could happen to you in a passenger jet. There's just no comparison. The Unity module's just been like the most amazing thing Boeing ever made. It's like 25 years with no retrofit, no, whatever. I guess they stick gum in the cracks or something. It's so ridiculous. We've conflated like the real ingenuity and engineering, of which there's been so much. Yeah, it's just interesting thinking about, like, okay, Boeing, and if it wasn't named Boeing, if it wasn't built around some dude's story of coming to the Northwest and like this red barn, it kind of symbolizes like trying to put a human face and a human story on what essentially always has been just a big military contractor juggernaut thing, but trying to like humanize it and trying to sell us on this idea of it being something that we take pride in and that we have all this like emotion, it's all this emotional investment. That's what I mean by like the microcosm of from when we think about technology and all these, this dream that people think we've been building over the past 100 plus years. And, to attack those narratives and basically be saying, congratulations, we've helped build the beast system to the point where now the luxury airline days are over. There's nothing but Greyhound level commercial air travel for the plebs. It's funny how like the private jet industry doesn't seem to be having all the same sorts of issues as the ones that we use. and how this ties into Agenda 21 and all that. But yeah, the decline is, I don't know, how much is a inevitable result of just fallen human nature and greed and just trying to kind of get more with less and pay your workers less, and just the broader economic direction that everything is going in. And how much of it is actually totally intentional and part of the whole tiered society they're trying to make, keep most people in 15-minute areas. Because both, I think, are reality. But I am curious to see if they actually get this thing off the ground. If there's anything weird that goes on with the Starliner launch that then ties into the Boeing safety narrative. Because it just feels like they're cooking up something. I don't know. So I'm curious what you guys might think about that. Because, yeah, the Boeing thing just went to meme level, like, so quickly. That, once everybody's heard of it and it's like the punchline is right at flying on a Boeing, that's not an accident. But as far as like, why is it trying to do a big corporate shakeup again or suspend, I don't know. We'll see what happens. But this is something that's been building up for many years. The legacy narratives. I feel like that's the part that people have the hardest time letting go of, whether it's just America in general and the idea that whole post-World War II baby boomer kind of, the American dream of owning your own, like, you don't have to tell the younger generations that dream is not within their reach, like it was to the older generations. You guys already know. I hear it's like everywhere you go, that's what you encounter, and people kind of realizing like, this is not my parents' America or my grandparents' America. But at the same time, that's why I think all the stuff that you kind of are forced to grapple with when you start allowing yourself to question if like the Bible could really be true to the degree that we are living in very close proximity to the return of Christ and the end of all this human legacy building, and trying to get our focus off of all these humanistic debates and worrying about all this infrastructure, and the economy and all this stuff that humans have been building for hundreds and thousands of years, that eventually it's all going to come to an end. And this is not the legacy that God, we're not going to need spaceships. We're not going to need flying machines and computers and internet in the new heaven and the new earth. I think we'll be able to travel just like we see Jesus, basically teleporting, I guess, or, he flew into the clouds at the end and having authority over the angels and never aging, no disease, no war, no social media, no corrupt governments. I think if this is not our hope and the reason why we're so thankful for what Christ has done, it's not just to give us all the things that the world has been promising for the past 100 years, because how many of those things are just a dream? Even if we have the technology to fly, did we ever get to the bottom of like where all the jet fuel is stored? Is that still a thing? Definitely not in the wings. I don't know. It's not this doom and gloom black pill reality to know that the system that we built is not our salvation. It's not our security. It's not our legacy. It's not what gives us meaning and purpose and pride in the things that we built or the companies that we've, this is idolatry. And I'm not saying that like it's wrong to work at Boeing or Microsoft or whatever, but at the same time, just coming to grips with the reality that the corporate stranglehold is so much bigger than even governments and all this election drama nonsense that's trying to occupy everybody's attention, when it's like there's an inevitability, I think. And when I think about like why people when I hear people say that word, conspiracy theory, so much of the time it's like you're scoffing at the idea that there's an infrastructure. You're laughing at the idea that your government or that a corporate entity would lie or defraud anyone or hurt anyone knowingly. It's just a very juvenile mentality when you think about it. It's a dream. It's a dream of human benevolence and love and Star Trek. You're deceived about the nature of mankind. whether it's conspiratorial or just basic sinful greed and selfishness and foolishness. Because, I mean, that's responsible for plenty of pain and suffering, too. But, I remember I think I was probably in like second grade, going to the Seattle Science Center as a kid, and they had this IMAX theater there, and watching this movie called The Dream is Alive. Looking back, it's like probably more than anything else that convinced me that it was real. When you're a little kid and you're sitting there and you feel like you're floating through space, hanging above the orb, this giant wraparound screen. Walter Cronkite's narrating it. I mean, it's hilarious looking back on it. But, you know, in the 80s, it was like you're born and you go to school and you go on a field trip, and it's like, oh, yeah, we're living in the future now. And space is this routine thing, just like getting on a plane. That was the whole narrative. Like, oh, we're repairing satellites in space and flying around with the jetpack. And it was all routine. It was all, you know, the beginning of the middle act of 2001. That was the narrative of the 60s, right? The 747, and we flew to the moon in a tin can. It's routine. It's normal. You know, if you can get on a jet plane and fly around the world, then how couldn't we have built that? You know what I mean? Like, that's the dream of flight.
Turbulence can happen, and sometimes it can happen unexpectedly. That's one of the reasons why you may notice, compared to years ago, more often you'll hear the captain or the flight attendants ask you to keep your seatbelt on, even if the light isn't saying that you're required to keep your seatbelt on. And again, this is something that has to continually evolve. Our climate is evolving, our policies and our technology and our infrastructure have to evolve accordingly too. This is all about making sure that we stay ahead of the curve, keeping aviation as safe as it is. It's not for nothing that it became the safest form of travel in America. We've got to treat that not as some mission accomplished, but something you have to continually refresh to keep that safety record up.
we so effectively demonstrate our technological leadership and ability to make life better on Earth. The space age is barely a quarter of a century old, but already we've pushed civilization forward with our advances in science and technology. Opportunities and jobs will multiply as we cross new thresholds of knowledge and reach deeper into the unknown. Our progress in space, taking giant steps for all mankind, is a tribute to American teamwork and excellence. Our finest minds in government, industry, and academia have all pulled together, and we can be proud to say we are first, we are the best, and we are so because we're free. When we dared to be great, we can reach for greatness again. We can follow our dreams to distant stars, living and working in space for peaceful economic and scientific gain. Tonight, I am directing NASA to develop a permanently manned space station and to do it within a decade. Permit quantum leaps in our research in science, communications, in metals, and in life-saving medicines which can be manufactured only in space. We want our friends to help us meet these challenges and share in their benefits. NASA will invite other countries to participate so we can strengthen peace, build prosperity, and expand freedom for all who share our goals.